Greetings, Greg Giesen here. The purpose of this video is to share some of my experiences with individual interventions and to also kind of give you a sense of the depth that's involved with this line of work. Now, I'm going to be toggling back and forth between PowerPoints and then just talking to you, but I've designed this around 9 questions, and let's just look at the questions first and then we'll go back and start talking about them. Okay. First question will be give an example of the wide array of individual interventions from my experience. Second question, what's the most common type of individual interventions? These are questions that I just figured would be kind of helpful to share with you. 3, what's the most complicated individual intervention I've ever dealt with? Well, of course, there's a plethora of those, but I'll just pick one out. Question 4, what's a typical intervention plan, if there is one? Question 5, talk a little bit about mandatory versus voluntary interventions. We'll talk briefly about that. 6, describe a successful intervention. 7, describe one of your most difficult individual interventions and why was it most difficult. 8, what are some of your lessons learned from doing this work? So I want to share some of my lessons learned. And then lastly, what advice do I have for you guys if you're thinking about getting into the field? So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just kind of talk a little bit. Hey, there you are. I guess what I want to say is to know that for the purpose of confidentiality, that obviously I'm going to change names, titles, even industries. I'm going to tweak things a little bit just to obviously protect other clients. What I want you to know is that I've been doing these interventions for about 30 years, and I continue to do them. And during those 30 years, pretty much all over the United States, depending where I went. So my clients were corporate America clients, they were nonprofit clients, and a number of colleges and universities. So needless to say, I have a lot of examples that I can use, and I just kind of randomly picked a few to share with you, just to give you, again, the breadth and depth of what this is. All right, so let's go with our first question. Sorry for the delay here. Okay, first question. Give an example of the wide array. Oh. This is how you know it's live. Give an example of the wide array of individual interventions. So I'm just going to kind of share a handful of them with you. Okay. I had an assistant principal who lacked political and social acumen. And what I mean by that is she had difficulty, you know, that part of your brain that stops you from saying something that you know you shouldn't say. She didn't have that part of her brain. I'm being humorous, but she had a tendency to blurt out kind of what she was thinking or feeling. And if there were more emotions, more things got blurted out. So that was really the focus of that intervention. An office manager at a medical practice. And in this situation, oh, by the way, the first one, the assistant principal, that was a voluntary intervention. The office manager situation was he had nurses and he had physician assistants that worked with the doctors, and those two groups didn't get along and kind of formed cliques, and he wanted to know what he could do to kind of fix that problem. I had a senior researcher who had a tendency to lash out when upset at students and even lab assistants. And ironically, they tended to all be women. So that was a scenario, and that was a mandatory intervention. I had an employee who was written up for performance issues, particularly everything from being late, to forgetting meetings, to being unorganized, being a poor communicator, terrible with emails, and also had a number of health issues that impacted attendance. I had an older career counselor who received complaints that the younger people could not relate to her, and she had trouble relating to them. That was a mandatory. I had a motivated manager who wanted to take a 360 to kind of see where he stood with his employees. I get a lot of those, and that was a voluntary scenario. I had a chair of a department that it was such a big department that the meetings were, 30 plus people, totally unmanageable, and the meetings ran poorly, and it just had impact from there. That was a voluntary intervention. I had a performing arts manager who liked to talk more about himself than the performing arts when he was doing tours and working with clients. And that was a problem, and that was a mandatory intervention. I had a struggling employee who was convinced that his boss was out to get him. That was a voluntary. I had an employee who gets teased by her peers. That was a voluntary intervention. I had a training manager who just doesn't feel like she fits in the organization that she got hired into. That was a voluntary intervention. And I have a situation, it's fairly recent, where a new supervisor with COVID, so she doesn't have COVID, but she came into the situation where she's managing people, but none of them are in the office. And so she's having some trouble forming relationships via the web or Zoom or whatever. And she has a strong employee that's been challenging her. And it's kind of escalated. In that case, the supervisor is a voluntary intervention, but then the employee who's eventually going to be part of this intervention, it's more mandatory for her. So it goes on and on and on, but that just kind of gives you a rough idea. All right, let's go to the next question. Okay. Let's see. What's the most common type of individual intervention? Okay. Well, here's the thing I would say, and it's going to kind of depend. What's not happening a lot, but I think what needs to happen a lot, is that employees that are put on performance improvement plans, really employees in general, but employees that are put on performance improvement plans, for me, have been probably the most common interventions. But that's because I work with organizations where they see value in providing coaching for those employees. I have found that most organizations don't provide coaching at all to employees. They do for management, but not employees. And I think that's a big, big mistake. So that would be what I would say. But if I took that out of the equation and I went with your typical company, I would say, and keep in mind, when I say coaching, I'm talking about individual interventions. That's probably the most common word that's used for individual interventions. But as you'll see in week 2, there's a lot of different words that could be described as. So I would say management coaching, and that could range from A to Z on any topic. Sometimes it's mandatory. Sometimes the manager's supervisor wants them to get executive coaching or coaching. Other times they just do it on their own because they want to improve. And then I'd probably say if there was a third one, it would be around conflict and conflict mediation. All right. Let's go next question. Next question. Sorry, I got kind of an antique little mouse here. Next question is, what's the most complicated individual intervention you've ever dealt with? All right. Well, I'm going to go back to the situation that I alluded to about the chair of a department, of a huge department. That was probably the most complicated, and I'll just give you some reasons why. First off, there were many strands, and what I mean by that is there's the initial situation, and then there's all these subsets off of it that involve other people, other situations, other dynamics. And so what you thought was cut and dry intervention, all of a sudden now there's all these secondary pieces that are part of the puzzle. And that's what this was. First off, you have a reluctant leader. And I'm not to be stereotypical, but a lot of chairs of departments are faculty members who are doing their turn to be chair, and many do not have management skills. They're great teachers or researchers or whatever they do, but a lot don't have management skills. And so there's a reluctance, especially if there's interpersonal dynamics or issues at stake. And that was the case in this situation. So there was a hesitancy to get involved in those. And then there was a lot of subunits in this department. I mean, official subunits, and in some subunits, they didn't get along within the subunit. And in other cases, it was subunits in conflict with other subunits. So that was happening. I mentioned that the meetings were way too large, and as a result, ineffective, and therefore people stopped going, or they didn't want to go, or they went with an attitude, which is not a great way to start a meeting. What was interesting in this scenario, and I can't stereotype, but in this scenario, I noticed in the spring is when a lot of the conflicts escalated in this department. My theory could be wrong. My theory is it's called the hit and run technique, is when you know you're about to go on summer break for 3 months or whatever it is. There's a safety in playing a conflict out because you know you're going to be sitting on a beach somewhere in 2 days. So conflicts tended to emerge right in the spring, and oftentimes it was never nearly enough time to resolve or address them. And then summer hit, fall comes, and it's a totally different scenario in the fall. So that was just something that was happening at the time. And I will say summer's kill the momentum, because maybe it's good in one sense that people get a chance to just let go of stuff, but at the other time, things just don't get addressed or handled over the summer. There are a lot of dysfunctional norms that have been part of this department for years, well before that chair took over, and they still existed. And people tended to talk to each other via email. And some of these emails were extensive and lengthy, and some were vicious. And that was one of the unhealthy norms in this group. And lastly, there was a dean who would be in charge of the chair that was AWOL. In other words, so busy, so involved in so many things that just did not have a lot of time to mess with these situations, which is probably why I got involved, right? So it was kind of a cyclical thing. So why was it complicated? Because as you can see, where do you even start on something like that? And then what if momentum breaks right in the middle? But that's the reality. Welcome to individual interventions. Okay, next question. All right, next question. It is, what's a typical intervention plan if there is one? Okay. Well, it's a hard one to answer because it's going to depend on what the intervention is. Let's take an employee that's been written up, and the supervisor has asked for you to meet with that employee. So a typical intervention plan would be first having a conversation with the supervisor, then getting a copy of the performance improvement plan, because that, frankly, is going to be the focus of the coaching. Because usually in those performance improvement plans, it is spelled out what the problem is, what needs to be corrected ASAP, and those kind of things. So there's a sense of urgency around that. So that's also the data collection. There might be other forms of data collection, but that's probably the main one because usually there's a rationale and all these things are stated out in this performance improvement plan. Then, of course, you have your initial meeting. So you've done all that before you've even met with the client. And keep in mind, it's probably going to be a mandatory situation, not a voluntary. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds, difference. So in that scenario, if there's not like a huge sense of urgency, like there's just things they want them to work on, you know, it's probably going to be a meeting. If there's urgency every week or every other week, if there's not, once a month, for probably 3 to 4 coaching sessions. And then because it was generated by the supervisor's involved in the sense that usually there's a follow-up summary report that goes back to the supervisor to kind of, you know, put completion on the whole process. And in the midst of that, we may discover that there's an assessment tool that would be really beneficial for this person to take. The one thing about assessment tools, and we'll talk about this in class, is that who's paying for them, you know? That's got to be some upfront material because sometimes people just don't have that kind of excess money. And then that means you got to figure that piece out. I will say that a number of individual interventions also are one-shot deals where people have a specific concern, a specific problem, they want to talk it out. And then if they need follow-up, they'll do it. But oftentimes the one session could do it. And then, of course, I have many clients that love to have a coach. And so we tend to meet on an ongoing basis, maybe once a month or whenever something arises, but usually something more structured. So the structure of the intervention plan does vary. Okay, next question. I hope this is helpful to you. But because it's online, I don't know when I'm going to be able to spell all this out for you. So, okay, talk a little bit about mandatory versus voluntary. And we've kind of begun to address it already. You know, the main thing I would say, because we'll discuss it in class, is think about it. If you're being forced to go to a coaching session or individual intervention, there's going to be emotion, there's going to be frustration, there's going to be anger, there's going to be resentment, there's going to be all these emotions. And what I've discovered, a whole different side of the story than the person who maybe forced you to go into this. So you've got all those dynamics to deal with, and you haven't even gotten into the reason for the intervention. So in those cases, I have found that I'm usually driving the process, trying to help them work through the emotions and get through all those, the mandatory part of it to where they can see value in this process. And then kind of get into whatever the issue is. And remember, they may not agree with the issue. So there's some of that going on. So I'm usually driving it to make sure we're getting somewhere. Voluntary, on the other hand, I would say the client usually drives the process because they want to learn something, they want to know, and I might provide a service or an education or whatever assessment for them. But it's their motivation that's driving it. So that's kind of the main difference between the two. All right, next question. All right. Describe a successful intervention. You know, keep in mind, a lot of the one-shot interventions, I would say, are probably pretty successful because clients got what they needed in one shot. But I'm going to use an example of, I had a faculty member that got himself into trouble because he was, had a hard time empathizing with students and came across very abrasive. And so over time, students complained about him. And I think at one point the department got fed up enough that they put him on a paid suspension. And part of that paid suspension was mandatory coaching or individual intervention. So it started off bad, right? Because he didn't want to be there and there's resistance and he didn't agree with this. And yet I found him to be the most effective client. Now we did this all by Zoom because he was from a university well outside of the state. But there was a structure. Because he was on suspension, you know, they gave him certain things that he had to accomplish, and we focused on those. He always showed up on time. I think every 2 weeks we met. He was motivated. He was learning. He really wanted to make a difference and make this situation change. And he was very motivated, and it was just a pleasure to actually work with him. We even got to the point where we looked at how he started his classes, and we agreed that maybe if he had some ground rules that he put out front with his students, because those were the kind of things that would trigger him, you know, about late policies, about when to contact him, you know, basic things that he never really spent time on. And then oftentimes he would get frustrated because he didn't think students were trying hard enough or whatever. So with those ground rules in place, we completed the whole process. Now, I will say that the one missing piece was his relationship with the assistant dean that kind of drove this. And so we had to do a conflict mediation at the end just to make sure those two are on the same page. But that was one that I thought was very effective. Okay, next question. All right. Describe one of your most difficult interventions and why. How much time do we have? All right, I got asked to work with a police chief. And the reason I got asked to work with the police chief was because a former employee had filed a sexual discrimination lawsuit. And so as the city government wanted to work with this police chief, and they also wanted to demonstrate that they took the complaint serious and they were going to do something with it. To be honest, I think they thought that that would be one, maybe 2 coaching sessions, slap on the hand, and it was all over. And for all I knew, maybe that's what it was going to be. But what I realized right off the bat is that I needed data collection right off the top. I needed to talk to government employees that worked with the chief just to get a broader view before I even met with the chief. I mean, I had met the chief, but before anything happened. And that's when everything imploded, because they gave me a list of maybe 8 people, you know, from all around the city, a nice variety. Seemed pretty innocent at this point. But I was doing these interviews at the police station, and what started happening was police officers at all levels would knock on the door and ask if they could be part of the interview, even though they weren't on the list. And yeah, I'm still at this point in time thinking everything's cool. So I'm like, yeah, why not? You know, I mean, and so more and more police officers started doing that. And what was coming out of these meetings was how volatile the police chief was, how abusive he was, and how dysfunctional the environment was. In fact, it got so bad that I felt a sense of emergency that I needed to do something. And so normally I might take a week to write a final kind of report. Whenever you interview people, you know, there's usually a summary. I did it that night and sent it urgently to the city attorney and to the president of the city council. And the biggest thing I was saying, first I alerted them to the problem, and then I said there needs to be an investigation, not by me, but by actually a professional investigation firm, that this was that bad. And what ended up happening was the report got frozen. I got essentially threatened that if I say anything, if I show the report to anyone, that everything I have, from my phone to computer to laptops to anything, will be confiscated. And then all of a sudden, everything was put on, like, shut down. And Then I find out that the police officers that snuck into the interview process who weren't on the list were fired the next day. So you can imagine this turned into this major ordeal where I had to actually seek legal counsel because all of a sudden everybody wanted my report. Lawsuits were then filed, and this whole thing just got way, way out of hand. And the reason why it became so complicated and so difficult was because what was asked for on the surface was not even close to what was really happening. And I think everybody didn't want me to step out of the parameters of just coach the police chief. And once I started doing the interviews, and that can happen in this business. So the other thing that's difficult for me to do is sometimes I know that a company wants to fire an employee and it turns out they don't have documentation, enough documentation to do it, and the HR department won't let them fire them initially. So they mandate coaching for the employee, but the intent all along is to get their ducks in a row so that they can fire this employee. And that's very difficult because when I do coaching or individual interventions, I like to think I make a difference. And I can't share, obviously, that kind of information, but I also know that when I see the employee really trying to work and change things, that it still may not work out. So that's just for me personally. All right, next question. I got two screens, as you can tell. What are some of your lessons learned from doing this work? Well, and this is just off the cuff, but let me, well, one that's been implied is what you see is not necessarily what you're going to get. The surface requests often are just surface requests, and there's a whole iceberg under the water that you don't even realize. And then you have to make a choice. Can you, should you, are you even capable of getting involved with that? The second thing is, and these aren't in order, but the work environment has to support the changes that you're helping the individual make. If sometimes the work environment created the dysfunction and you're getting the symptom by working with a particular employee, then you send them back into the dysfunctional work environment as if they're supposed to be able to sustain the changes. It's going to be very challenging. So that's why the work environment plays a big role in this kind of work. It's got to support. And when I say work environment, the supervisor of the person, the colleagues, the peers, all those kind of things. For me personally, one of the lessons learned is to remain non-attached. I have had situations, keep in mind, I've been doing this for so long, where I decide as part of the data collection is to interview employees, and then after the fourth one, I'm hearing the same emotional story. It impacts me. I feel like I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God. When the reality is I need to be neutral and non-attached throughout the whole process. Otherwise, everything I'm doing is ineffective as well, because I'm just part of the problem. So that's just something I have to be mindful and stay on top of all the time. The other thing I've learned is that if there's strife or dysfunction or groups are in conflict, there needs to be strong leadership for those groups. And if there isn't, that's going to be a problem. And I may not be coaching the leader. So then what? And then the other thing is to be clear on your parameters, to make sure that you're clear on what it is that you're working with, because there's a lot of gray area, like when you see these additional problems. And then the question is where do you draw the line in that one? So, and I'll just answer the last question instead of toggling back and forth. It was, what advice do I have for you? Well, this could change at the end of the class, as we go through this, because it's a new class and we'll just see what everybody thinks. But I would say, first off, that interventions aren't unusual. Managers do them all the time. They do them on the fly. Someone's stuck on something, they're helping them. Someone's having a conflict, try and work with them. Performance reviews are an individual intervention. So they're not that unusual. In fact, really, we have them with our friends, our kids, our parents, colleagues, you know, whenever you're having a one-on-one conversation with an intent in mind to change something. So they're not that unusual. So just know that. Second thing I would say truthfully, you know, maybe if this is just a skill you just kind of want to learn, that's fine. If you could see yourself kind of specializing in this as an OD consultant, then I would say get as many skill sets as you can. And in week 2, you know, we're going to talk about the different skill sets, you know, like conflict mediation, group facilitation, mentoring versus coaching versus learn and develop a skill set in all those, because you might need them all. Or otherwise, if you don't, you're going to farm out work. You know, like you guys, you're working with the supervisor who's got it, you know, and he's got the 2 clicks, and you don't feel comfortable dealing with that. So then you're going to farm that out to somebody. Somebody needs to do the team building. Now you've got 2 professionals involved, and all of a sudden it starts to get layered. So get as many of those skill sets as you can. And the last thing is go easy on yourself. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I beat myself up because I'm like, why did I say that? Or how did I include that? Or how did I miss that? Or it didn't work. So I'm no good, you know, that kind of stuff. See, so it's constant kind of working on yourself and having colleagues, and just kind of, the more you do this work, the more you find a centered place, and then you become unattached, and a lot of that stuff doesn't affect you. But I'd be lying if I said the first 2-3 years, it was hard not to take it personally, because I thought it was a reflection of me. Now I know as an experienced interventionist that it has nothing to do with me. My job is to create a safe container. Whatever happens, happens, but I don't own it. But I do have integrity, and I know that I'm always doing my best. So hopefully that was helpful. And we'll continue on. Take care.